class, my name is Marie Huntsinger and welcome to EdVantage. Today we're going to be talking about types of research methods in sociology and also the importance of research ethics. Okay, so the first research method that we're going to be talking about are qualitative interviews. Interviews are a qualitative research method where the researcher asks respondents either open or close-ended questions, typically open, and records the responses using either handwritten notes or audio. Then these interviews are typed up or transcribed into usually Word documents where we're able to go through and find certain themes that we can then later write about in our analysis section. So for someone who is math adverse, you might think, interviews, yes, I would rather do that than statistical analysis. Well, something to consider is that interviews can be quite costly and can be very time consuming. So take for example for my master's thesis, I interviewed about 20 community college students, staff, and faculty about their experiences with an honors program. While I was able to get a lot of rich data from these 20 to 30 minute interviews, I also had to go back and transcribe them. And I ended up with hundreds of pages of typed transcripts that then I had to make sense of. So it is a time-consuming process. The advantage is that you get a lot of in-depth information that you may not get from just a survey. It's especially good too if you want to talk about more sensitive subjects like drug use or sexuality, because you can ask a question in different ways to try to get more of an honest answer out of people. But the limitation is that it's costly, it's time consuming, and typically you have smaller sample sizes that can affect the robustness of your research results. So the next method we're going to talk about is two methods, is external observation and ethnography, or sometimes called participant observation. So external observation is when a sociologist goes and observes people in their setting. So for example, if I was an education researcher and I was interested in the behavior of fourth grade students, I might go and observe a fourth grade classroom over a series of 6 months and write what I observe. Now, as a researcher in this situation, I am not actively interacting with the children or the teacher. I'm just there to take notes. On the other hand, participant observation or ethnography is when the sociologist actually becomes part of the group and studies or observes the behavior of the group members, but they're also participating within the group. So an example of participant observation or ethnography is this researcher named Sudhir Venkatesh, who wrote a book called Gang Leader for a Day. And so picture this, a sociologist with a doctorate degree goes and lives amongst different gang groups for several months. And he was interested in how they structured their businesses. They were interested in how the gang actually formulated close-knit community ties. And so he was able to use the ethnography. He was able to gain trust of the gang members in order to give him access. And then he was able to write a very interesting book after that. So advantages of this is that for participant observation is that the observer gets to know the group very well. But a limitation is sometimes if you're living with a group for 6 months, 24 hours a day, you might have so much information that you might not even know what's important or where to start your analysis. The technique is also very time consuming. And also there's this term called going native that sometimes happens to ethnographers or participant observation researchers, where you actually become so immersed in the group that you lose your sense of objective research. So for example, you might fall in love with a research participant because you are human after all, right? Sociologists are people. And then of course you can see how that may cause ethical issues when trying to look at it objectively. So the next type of research we're going to talk about is survey research. Survey research is when you ask respondents specific questions, usually close-ended questions, either on a Likert scale, so a scale of 1 to 5, or yes or no questions, or check a box. This is the most commonly used tool in sociological research. So some sociologists who are interested in macro level issues, broad scale, would use large data sets like the census or the general social survey in order to try to figure out correlations. So questionnaires can be distributed either over the phone, which is becoming less common because people really don't answer their home phones as much anymore. A survey can be distributed over email. A survey could also be distributed via mail. So advantages is that it reaches a large number of people, so your sample sizes tend to be a lot bigger. And you can ask people an array of questions on a variety of topics. However, there are some limitations to this. So for example, you may force people into a box. So say for example, in the United States Census, they didn't allow people to choose more than one race until the year 2000. And so what this means is that if you were multiracial or biracial, that you had to either choose, white or Asian. You couldn't choose both. And so then you really put people in kind of an awkward predicament where they're feeling like they're choosing one side of their heritage and not the other. Also limitations, and this is true of all research, but people don't represent themselves truthfully all the time, especially if you are asking questions of a sensitive nature. And this can happen, of course, when you interview someone too, but then there's ways that you can ask the question in several different types of ways during an interview that you can get more honest responses. Okay, so let's talk about the two different types of data. We have primary data, and this is data that is gathered by the sociologist. And so this is, you design the research survey, and you get to focus on what you actually care about. So the great thing about this is you get to tailor it based on your needs and what you want to study. The disadvantage is you don't get to have as big of a sample size compared to like the US Census that surveys everyone in the United States. So types of secondary data would be the census, national crime statistics, or FBI. And again, secondary data is data that is collected by a third party, usually a government agency. So experiments aren't commonly used in sociology. However, occasionally we do talk about sociological experiments, especially ones that happened in the 60s and 70s. We'll talk more about those famous experiments in later videos. But experiments are usually quantitative, and the thing with experiment is that you're measuring the independent variable's effect on the dependent variable. And so you have to hold all other variables constant. Contain both experimental and control groups. So we're interested in changing one thing in a research design. So for example, I'm interested in my previous example, just students test better when they're given candy versus students who don't test better when they're not given candy, right? So I would change one variable and keep one group a control group. So one group wouldn't get any candy, one group would get candy. And then I would see if that had any effects on the results. So the advantage of this is that we can establish cause and effect relationships much easier than in other research methods. Typically there's good reliability. The researcher remains emotionally uninvolved because you're an objective observer and you can get an exact measurement. However, often experiments are criticized or critiqued because of course, real life is different from a lab or from a college classroom. And so, okay, this happened in a college classroom, but could we apply this to other settings? Content analysis is kind of a cool research method. This is a method that is unobtrusive, which means that you don't actually have to bother anyone for this or ask anyone to answer any questions for you. This is both qualitative and quantitative. And what you do with content analysis is you're interested in what we call cultural artifacts. So for example, magazines, TV programs, comic books, movies, popular music. So say I'm interested in how are women depicted in 1950s sitcoms versus sitcoms in 2019. Well, I might go back and look at all of the sitcoms from 1950. Leave It to Beaver, let's see, maybe Bewitched from the 1960s. And then I would look at more modern television shows like Modern Family, for example. And then I would write up my analysis and how many times the woman served the man or whatever I was interested in, and I was able to write up my results that way. So what's cool about this is, it's unobtrusive, you don't have to, rely on anyone, but also we don't actually get any interpretation. So artifacts can't tell us what people actually think. So we can't go back in time and interview people, from the 1950s. So it's really important that sociologists and all scientists adhere to standards of ethics. So the potential benefit of the research must outweigh the risk to participants. So what this means is, when you're going to do research and you're going to use human subjects, you have to make sure that you're not going to cause trauma or harm. And if you do, that the research outcomes are more beneficial than the risks. So researchers must inform the participants of their rights, and they usually have to let participants know that if they want to withdraw from the study, they can do it any time. They must obtain informed consent. Usually it's a written document that they sign. Practice confidentiality and anonymity. So you keep all of your records on a password-protected computer or in a locked file cabinet. It's also really important that scientists do not falsify data, and that you cite appropriately, no plagiarism, and that you're open and transparent with your research methods and data. You also need to disclose any compensation that you're receiving from outside sources, and be mindful of how this funding may bias your research. Most universities and prisons have what we call institutional review boards, and these are institutions that look over your research proposal, your methods, and your questions in order to make sure that your research design is ethical. Okay, so always question correlation versus causation, and this is when you're looking at studies in the media. Who is being studied? Is the sample representative? So again, if we're interested in all men, but the study only looks at teenage men, then that's not representative of all men. Is it generalizable to the population? How are they defining and measuring terms? This is an important one, especially with fuzzy terms like social class. What does middle class mean? Is there a number or range to that? Is the study able to be replicated and tested again? And this is a big one. Who is funding the research? So for example, if you read a study that says eating McDonald's hamburgers will cause your blood pressure to decrease, well, you might look at that with a more skeptical eye than if the National Institute of Health, which is a non-biased government agency, does the study. Also, what is the study's implications? What does it mean? How are we to use these results to impact behavior or policy? So I really love this graphic here. Danger! Dihydrogen monoxide is colorless and odorless. Accidental inhalation of DHMO may be fatal. Prolonged exposure to it in its solid form causes severe tissue damage. And symptoms of DHMO ingestion can cause excessive sweating and urination, and possibly a bloating feeling, nausea, vomiting, and body electrolyte imbalance. Ooh, scary, right? Oh my gosh, where do we find this dangerous substance? Well, it's water. So dihydrogen monoxide is actually water. So that's also something to be looked at when research is being sensationalized in the media as well. Kind of take a step back and be like, what does this actually mean? What are the implications? So thank you for tuning in today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.